Okay, so this week's video is probably going to be quicker than some of my past longer form videos. I did mention recently that I want to try some new stuff, and this is kind of that, but also kind of not, as this is more of a hybrid between a new idea and my usual content. It's an analysis of whether or not gems are technically alive, whether or not they qualify as living beings, as life forms. But it's also something of an opinion piece, and you'll see what I mean once the end of the video starts to roll around. This is actually Karen's idea, believe it or not, and I definitely believe it, not only because I was here, but also because being an artificial intelligence like the gems seemingly are, she's pretty invested in pretty much everything to do with their species. Though, can I even use the term species to refer to the gems? That's actually one of the questions that this video is going to try to answer. Speaking of Karen, though, I've been making adjustments to her program, and now that the last of them have been completed, she should be a little bit different. Hey, Karen, updates are finished. You shouldn't have to rely on those imported images anymore. You should be able to make a face of your own. Oh, hey, I like it. It's not really what I would have envisioned, but it's definitely cool.
Thank you. I'm quite fond of it as well.
Karen, is your new voice just my voice, pitched up slightly?
No. Yes, but I like your voice.
Okay, but I mean, we might have to come up with something a little more, I don't know, permanent than that at some point. I don't know, let's see what people think of it. But yeah, anyway, let's get on to the subject matter at hand. Are gems a life form? I mean, I certainly treat them as one. I've even gone on record to say that I consider them people, despite the fact that the normal definition of people tends to only include humans. So, on the topic of definitions, let's look at how a life form is defined. I'm going to pull this up from the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and a life form is just defined as the body form that characterizes a kind of organism, such as a species, at maturity. It can also be defined as a kind of organism. So it looks like we really need to go and look at what an organism is exactly. An organism is defined as an individual animal, plant, or single-celled life form, which is a little circular considering that life form got us here in the first place. There's also another definition here that I'm going to talk about a little bit in just a little while. A whole with interdependent parts likened to a living being. This one is more referring to things which are likened to organisms, like society is likened to an organism because it's a bunch of parts functioning independently and yet together. To look at another take on that same definition, this one is from freedictionary.com. It's any complex organized body or system analogous to a living being, especially one composed of mutually interdependent parts functioning together, or anything resembling a living creature in structure or in behavior. Also, if we look back at the original definition, we can see synonyms for organism, one of them being a being, which, if we look at how being is defined, there are two here which I think pertain to this particular argument: the nature or essence of a person, and a real or imaginary living creature or entity, specifically an intelligent one, which I think already gives us a tentative form of our answer. Like, obviously this could be debated, sure, but these two definitions do certainly pertain to the gems, don't they? We know from that now infamous section in Guide to the Crystal Gems that Rose was able to transfer everything that she was to Stephen. Wouldn't that constitute her essence? Like, I don't know if essence would be the best name for it, but couldn't we consider essence to be a close synonym to whatever that is? And the gems are definitely real, at least in universe, intelligent entities. So the second definition describes them to a T. And for those who question whether or not the gems are in fact entities, if we look at the definition of what an entity is, it is anything with distinct and independent existence. So sure, maybe there are gems who we could consider non-entities. Maybe like those wall gems, for example, or the other object gems that we saw around Homeworld, but at the very least, the crystal gems, their entire mission and the entire statement of the show is very insistent upon gems, at the very least, having the potential to become their own distinct and independent things, their own entities. that even if they weren't originally intended to function independently, gems are independent entities that are being forced to conform and act together when otherwise they wouldn't. Or at least in a way that otherwise they wouldn't. But backtracking a bit for a minute, I think we can go even more in depth than this and prove this even harder. I mentioned that gems seem to have some kind of essence to them, as Rose was able to pass on what she was to Steven. And all of the evidence and all of the terminology used in the series seems to suggest that that essence is information. It's data. This is where the theory that gems are just sentient or sapient, depending on which word you like better these days, computers comes from. And couldn't, let's say computer code specifically, be described as a whole with interdependent parts? Couldn't different sections of that code be described as mutually independent parts which function together as a complete whole? Couldn't they be described as complex? And so even though they themselves are not living, they themselves are not organisms, they themselves are not life forms, if they come to resemble a living creature in behavior or structure, wouldn't they suddenly become an organism by definition?
Think of it this way. As an artificial intelligence, I am something which resembles a living creature in structure or behavior. My various data components are organized together into a system which simulates a living thing. But without the example of that which has been predetermined by society to be the model for a living thing, wouldn't my systems suddenly become the default? Wouldn't I by default be considered a life form? Wouldn't this question not even exist? And the gems are even more anthropomorphic, even more human, even more alive than I am.
That's a really good point, isn't it? Already, an artificial intelligence like Karen would arguably be a life form, and the gems are even closer to what we think of as a life form than she is. Yes, the traits which make gems seem alive are simulated, but as Karen suggested, if we didn't already have an example of a non-simulated living thing, how would we distinguish between the simulation and a non-simulation? Can we even distinguish between a simulation and a non-simulation if the simulation grows complex and accurate enough? There is an entire theory, which is taken fairly seriously by the scientific community, which suggests that our entire universe could be a simulation, but that because of how complex it is, it's difficult for us to tell. Most simply, though, there is another definition of organism which I think pertains to the gems, which I think could answer this question definitively, and that is an individual living thing. Living things, of course, being things which are alive. So are the gems alive? Well, alive is defined as having life, which is defined as not dead or inanimate. The gems are definitely animate, and hence are not inanimate, and they definitely have a living state and a dead state. To them, being whole is considered alive, and being shattered is considered as close to dead as they can possibly get, as their mind and therefore their self, their essence, their information, is damaged to the point that it no longer truly exists and can never exist again. So, yeah, I would say that gems are alive. And if they are alive, then they are organisms. And if they are organisms, then they are life forms. And let's be absolutely clear about something. Regardless of whether or not the gems would be considered alive or life forms in the truest sense in our world, they definitely are treated as such in the universe of the show. And I do think that if we encountered a being like a gem in real life, again, even if the term life form or the term alive wouldn't encompass that being immediately, that those terms would grow and change to encompass a being like that. I think that would be the only true and right thing to do. And this is important because it's very possible that someday we might create an AI so sophisticated that it can learn, and that we can't disprove its sapience, that we can't disprove its sense of self. And on that day, we are going to have to look into a mirror and decide how we plan to treat this new being that we have created. It is my personal opinion that anything which shows at least a relatively human amount of intelligence and self-awareness should be treated as if it has personhood. And I really do think that we should get to work defining exactly what those terms mean, how exactly we might gauge a thing like that, because as of right now, they're surprisingly vague. So, as you can tell, despite the fact that I think I backed up my points pretty well with facts and analysis, I was never, at the end of the day, ever going to determine that the gems weren't life forms in universe, simply because if I did, it would undermine one of my core beliefs, which is how analyses like these, when they do pop up from time to time, are going to differ from my other theories and analyses. This was as much an opinion piece as it was an analysis, and while I do occasionally use my opinion on where I feel the show is going to determine which theories I consider more likely, for example, for the most part, past theory and analysis videos took facts into account first and my opinions into account second. At the end of the day, while I am, of course, curious to know what you guys think on this subject, I am at the very least just as interested to hear what you guys think of this particular video format as an idea. Would you like to see more stuff like this where I inject my own personal views and opinions into a video which draws upon Steven Universe or one of the other shows that I cover as inspiration? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below or over in my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22 and I will talk to you guys later.